Thank you very much, Professor Mary Heimann from Cardiff University, for talking to me this afternoon. And we're talking on the subject of nationalism, but particularly in terms of nationalism and the creation and eventual dissolution of Czechoslovakia. Mary, Czechoslovakia came into being as a state in 1918. What part, if any, did nationalism have to play with the creation of the state?
Right. Well, I think you need to start by thinking of Czechoslovakia as being just one part, a sort of linchpin in a whole reconstruction of Central Europe.
Yes.
So, in the sort of vacuum left by the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, you had 11 or more nationalities all jockeying for position and looking for advantage. But I suppose I would really want to stress the contingency of Czechoslovak independence. There had never been such a state before, and I think had it not been in the interests of the Allies to create it, it wouldn't have happened.
But
So
yeah, but it involved two different ethnic groups, the Czechs and the Slovaks. Did the Czechs believe that they would have the advantage in terms of numbers in this new state? Were they bound by any ties to the Slovaks in the first place? Or was it just a kind of an arbitrary creation of a state that they thought would work?
Well, I wouldn't say it was arbitrary exactly. The idea of bringing together Czechs and Slovaks who had never shared any state in the past at any point in their history was because they had a common language or a similar language. So Czech and Slovak are mutually intelligible. You know, they sound what I suppose in German you would think would be a dialect rather than a language apart. I mean, they are separate languages, but the ethnicity, if you like, in Central Europe is based on language. So that the idea was to try and forge out of two peoples this new idea, this idea of a Czechoslovak person, which didn't really work. There were a few boom years at the start where people were keen to give it a go, but it rather fell back.
Sorry, go ahead, Mary, go ahead.
No, the only thing I just wanted to add was that you said that there were two ethnicities, but of course there were many more. And the problem, if you like, that Czechoslovakia was supposed to solve from a Czech point of view was that there were historic grounds for having the territory of Bohemia, what's today the territory of the Czech Republic, as a polity, but it was 1/3 German and 2/3 Czech speaking. So in order to overcome the problem of such a large minority, they had to then join with the Slovaks, who had traditionally been in Hungary. They'd never been in the Habsburg, and they'd never been in Austria. So they were brought over, if you like, to make up numbers so that Czechs and Slovaks together could outnumber Germans and Hungarians. That was the idea.
I was very struck looking up some background on this, the number of, the amount of Germans in Czechoslovakia when it was created. In fact, there was more Germans than there were Slovaks.
Yes, absolutely. So again, what's today the Czech Republic and Slovakia were in those days, the Czech Republic was what was known as the lands of the Bohemian Crown. And that territory was 1/3 German and always had been. So there had long been moves for Bohemian independence or Bohemian autonomy, but that was to include the Germans.
Yes.
Where the nationalism comes in is where you then got a new idea of Czech dominance, which by joining with the Slovaks could make a sort of Slav dominance over Germans and Hungarians, who are not Slav speakers.
Well, now, if you take these three main groups, the Czechs, the Slovaks, and the Germans, did they see themselves as being part of Czechoslovakia the way Germans or any other nationality would go to America and see themselves as Americans eventually?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, it depends what period you're asking. So the legacy in Hungary, where Slovakia came from, had been a kind of melting pot idea, so like the American model, whereas the Austrian half had been more like a sort of British model, if you like. It was more about devolution. So you have these different conceptions of what it is to be a nation overlapping and conflicting. So that's what makes it so complicated. It's difficult to give simple answers.
were the Czechs comfortable with the notion of these various other ethnic groups or nationalities as part of Czechoslovakia, or would they have preferred to have had their own state in which, you know, was largely composed of Czechs, or was that possible?
Well, I suppose the question, you have to come back to how the nationality was defined.
Yeah.
So this changed. So in the Habsburg Empire, it all came down to what you answered in the census question.
Yeah.
So of course you're speaking of a territory where very many people were bilingual or trilingual. Mm. So if your mother's Czech and your father's German, are you German or Czech? You weren't allowed to be both, right? You couldn't be Jewish and German and Czech. You had to choose. So you were only allowed to choose one nationality, which to me was the fatal flaw. In the Habsburg period, the question that was asked to determine your nationality was, what is your language of daily use?
Yes.
So what language do you speak when you're at school or at work is what that means in effect. So of course that inflated the number of so-called German nationals and Hungarian nationals. Under Czechoslovakia, they changed the question so that it read, what is your language, your maternal language? What language did your mother speak? And then, of course, that inflated the number of Czechs and Slovaks. So a lot of people, large numbers of people didn't have a fixed nationality. So you quite often get people changing their nationality from one census to the next, depending on what was more advantageous. And I suppose it's a sort of central tragedy of the 20th century that as the nationalism got more and more exclusive and fascistic, I think you'd have to call it, it became increasingly, it was fate determining. If you had decided you were German in the census, that might mean you were lording it over the Czechs during the Second World War, but then you might be expelled after the war. If you had put yourself down as Czech, you might be in a prison camp during the war, but then afterwards be an inheritor. If you had put yourself down as Jewish, you might end up in a gas oven. Mm-hmm. So, it was terribly important in the end what you answered to that innocuous little question.
So language was very important in determining what nationality people saw themselves as. But you said that somebody might have a German father and some other nationality mother. How would their nationality be established? Was that because they spoke German or whatever?
This is what I'm saying. It officially you belonged to one nationality only, but it was only determined by what you answered in that census on that one occasion.
So it didn't matter where you lived then. It was based on language rather than
language. The only exceptions were for Jews, where it could be based on either language or religion, mm-hmm. and the Roma, where it could be based on, but they didn't count as an official nationality. Mm-hmm. So that was based on race. But it meant that you could choose to be German or Czech. So, for example, the father of the Czechoslovak nation, who was, the father of Czechoslovakia,
yes.
He, according to the census rules, would have been classified as a German because his mother was German, and the leader of the sort of a very extreme Sudeten German party, which allied itself to Hitler. He would have really been classified as Czech under the laws. So there were absurdities.
That's hugely interesting. Would that have been the case with? This is the League of Nations we're talking about that created presumably Czechoslovakia. Would that have been the sort of defining factor in terms of nationality for other states that were perhaps established then?
That's a good question. First of all, I'm not an expert on everything, but one of the things that came to fascinate me was the way that race or ethnicity came to be defined differently in different parts of Central Europe. So if we pick an example, the example of Jews, for example, in the late 30s and 40s, in Slovakia, you were defined as a Jew according to religion. In Germany, as we know, you were defined according to race. And in what's today the Czech Republic, you were defined according to language. Mm. So you could be the same person, and depending on where you were born, you might or might not be classified as a Jew.
Would that have applied particularly to Jews, or would it have been something that applied, to other nationalities or other ethnic groups?
To a certain extent, also to other nationalities. So in what was Czechoslovakia, language was the crucial determinant. Yeah.
There's a saying in Irish by a famous Irish patriot, Patrick Pearse, Chirgan Changa Chirgan Anam, meaning a country without a language is a country without a soul. So, from what you're saying, Mary, it suggests that a country without a language doesn't exist, let alone have a soul.
I think that was the logic of some Czech nationalists, that language and nationhood are coterminous.
Yeah. Well, I can see the advantage, or I can see the strengths for the Czechs moving into this new state of Czechoslovakia. Were the Slovaks equally at ease with it? Because, I mean, they were only 16% or something of the population.
There were mixed feelings. I mean, first of all, the Slovak history is, I think, particularly fascinating, because if you look at where Slovak nationalism was before the First World War, I mean, there was almost no, there was some Slovak nationalism, but there's supposed to have been 1,000 families who considered themselves Slovak, okay? Good. Consciously Slovak. And to have gone from that in 100 years to a fully fledged, working, functioning state where the language is Slovak is pretty amazing. So, but it wasn't an easy transition. And, you know, you get different assessments of this depending on whether you ask a Czech or a Slovak. So the Czechs felt that they gave Slovaks a lot, that they gave them the institutions they needed to become a nation. Slovaks, some at certain times certainly resented the Czechs as, you know, oppressing them by insisting on speaking their language, filling their own people in jobs and so on. So there's a disputed history there.
Yeah, the Czechs, as I understand, you know, for maybe 50 years anyway, before the formation of the state, were working at creating a sense of Czechness. That wouldn't then have been true of the Slovaks. They weren't, you know, developing a sense of being Slovak and the Slovak culture.
I guess, again, I suppose we'd want to look at the whole context of late 19th century nationalism. So the whole region, you know, Germans were the first, if you like, to come up with this idea of an imagined community of Germanness or Germandom. The Czechs weren't very far behind. They were kind of keeping up with the Germans, if you like. The Slovaks were later. I mean, there are individuals you can point to, but I'd say as a sort of mass movement, it was a later development. And then we can look at another example on that same continuum, the Ruthenians, who never really got their own state. And so you can see, I'd see this as a continuum where each of the nationalities in the Habsburg Empire was consciously competing with the others. And so, if you like, the stakes kept getting higher and higher. There was, there was a feverish kind of rival nationalism. And if you go to the Czech Republic or Slovakia today, you know, you see there can never just be one opera. There's got to be the German opera, and then the Czech opera, and then the Slovak opera, and the Hungarian opera. And so you get a lot of operas, right? And you get
yeah. Are you suggesting that nationalism essentially is a creation of the 19th century then?
I think in its modern form, I would say so. I mean, I would say I would date it really from the French Revolution onwards. I mean, I know that you can go back and see language that sounds similar, but I'm not sure that what was meant before the French Revolution was quite the same sort of thing. I mean, that's a very loose answer.
But again, you're stressing language. I always thought of nationalism in terms of territory. I mean, certainly if you think about Ireland, if you were to say to an Irish person or an Irish nationalist that the idea of Irish nationalism only appeared in the 19th century, they would go up the walls, you know, they would say it going back for centuries before that. Are they the exception then, or?
No, I suppose there are comparable sorts of, if you want to call it nationalism, that you could say about the Czechs. For example, I mean, you know, this is the nation of Hus, this is the Hussite Wars and so on, the Kingdom of Bohemia. But I suppose where I'd want to point to a difference is that sort of nationalism was about territory, but it was what the Germans called land patriotism. So it was about where you're from. It wasn't so much about your ethnic identity. So you could be a German and be just as good a Bohemian as you could be a Czech speaking Bohemian. And indeed, if you were an aristocrat, you probably spoke French or Latin, or, you know, so it's I think the idea of you being innately from one people, I think is quite modern in that sense.
Uh-huh.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Sorry, go ahead, Mary, finish.
Oh, no, you're fine.
Uh, uh, when this new state of Czechoslovakia was formed, you suggested, did you, that there was an optimism in the early stages where the two, let's say the Slovaks and the Czechs, were moving and knitting together in harmony, or were they pulling apart from the beginning?
Well, just to be clear, I mean, for the first 2 years of Czechoslovakia, Slovakia was under Czech military rule. So, you know, how harmonious that was.
Not a good start.
Yeah, and there was, you know, a Czech governor appointed to sort of look over things. To put that in context, this was also it was a very confused and volatile period at the end of the First World War. So Hungary, as I'm sure you know, had just had a communist revolution, and indeed had a 6-month-long communist Soviet. And Eastern Slovakia, there was a communist uprising. So this was all done with to a certain extent with the blessings of the Paris peacemakers, and partly the Czechs sort of sold Czechoslovakia as a remedy, a way of keeping Central Europe from going communist. So there were a lot of factors, but I don't suppose it was terribly well looked on. And then there was a religious element as well, because Slovak nationalists at this stage, originally they were Protestant actually, and then by this stage it was moving to being a Catholic phenomenon, and the Czechs were quite although Catholic, are anti-clerical. So there was a lot of resentment from Slovaks being, you know, having Catholic symbols and Christian symbols being disrespected by the Czechs. So there are many dimensions to this.
So you're suggesting that part of the national makeup might have been religion as well as a language?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't officially that, but that was, and as you probably know, after the Munich crisis, Slovakia went independent for a time, and that independent regime was a so-called clerical fascist regime. So it was the only, I think, fascist state to be led by a Catholic priest, Father Tiso. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was eventually excommunicated, but still. Mm-hmm. So there's a religious thread running through this. And as I say, Czechs are technically Catholic, but the Hussite legacy was such that you could mistake them for Protestants. It's hard, and Protestant skeptics and agnostics at that. So it's a complicated situation.
It all sounds very familiar from here.
There are fascinating parallels. Yeah.
Would on the territory of Czechoslovakia, would Czechs and Slovaks have intermingled, or would there have been parts that would have been identified as very largely Slovak and parts that would have very largely been Czech?
Yeah, the territories were absolutely clear. So there was a territory called Slovensko, which was today's Slovakia, and that was, as it were, the Slovak-speaking region. However, and then there were the Bohemian Crown lands, which are that's the territory that makes up today's Czech Republic, which up till the war was German and Czech-speaking, mainly Czech-speaking, but also German, Polish. And of course, Slovakia had a very significant number of Hungarian speakers as well. Mm-hmm. So that was their other, if you like. Yeah. So to an extent, the Czechs' traditional enemies, if you like, were the German speakers, and the Slovak nationalist traditional enemies were Hungarians. So to that extent, they were fairly friendly. but then there were also many misunderstandings, mutual misunderstandings, and I suppose the inevitable relationship of when you have one nation that's the stronger power than the other. You know, the Czech Republic got all the good bits. It had the capital, it had the industrial wealth. It was the richer. It wasn't just the more populous half, it was also the richer half. So, yeah.
From the point where it was formed to the point where it dissolved, the Czechoslovakia, or parts of it, were controlled by communism or Nazis. What effect did that have on them? Did it sharpen their sense of themselves as a separate people, or did it, muffle it?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, first of all, before the Nazi period, properly speaking, there was a twilight period, if you like, between Munich and the takeover of the Czech part by Germany. So there was a period where the state was still independent, but was very right-wing. So I think that's quite an interesting period to see what happened to nationalism in that period. And during that period, so before the takeover by Germany, already, for example, Jews were excluded from being allowed to belong to the national community, communists were excluded, gypsies were excluded, and they began to be rounded up and put into camps. So there was already, even, I mean, I suppose you could say Germany was the superpower and was already influencing all the countries in Central Europe, but there was already the beginnings of some idea of ethnicity creeping into nationalism, because you could be a gypsy and speak Czech, but somehow you weren't quite counted a Czech. So there was a change there into how the community defined itself. As far as communism goes, the communist regime used Czech nationalism. It didn't reject it. It just changed the meaning of it. So it emphasized that Jan Hus was also a proletarian leader, and it embraced all movements deemed to be progressive, including nationalist movements. So it celebrated the creation of the so-called bourgeois state, but then said, well, it presented history as a kind of progression towards an ever more perfect socialism. Yeah.
So throughout the existence of Czechoslovakia, there would still have been the main factor would have been a sense of ethnicity, that they were different, or would, for example, when the communism ruled, would you say that the notion of communism or being a communist or having a communist country or state was more important to people than this notion of nationalism?
I think initially I don't think there was felt to be a conflict between, and first of all, I wouldn't say it was ethnicity. I would say it was still language that makes you, language that makes you a Czech or so. Okay. Certainly in the Czech half of the country, Czech-speaking half, communism, in the immediate post-Second World War, there was this idea of a Czechoslovak road to socialism, which was going to be more evolutionary. It wasn't going to be on the Soviet model. It was going to be a distinct Czech, and it was very popular. I mean, it had its opponents, but the country was more or less split down the middle. It was more or less, a sort of Brexit kind of division, if I can put it that way. So I think it was roughly half. I mean, Czechoslovakia was unusual in that the communists were voted into power in genuine free elections. Now, they weren't entirely fair elections because the right-wing parties had been banned. The extreme right-wing parties had been discredited and banned. So you can argue about whether it was really entirely, but they weren't stage managed. There were no Soviet troops on the soil. So it was a very different story. Whereas Slovakia, which is traditionally much more conservative, more Catholic and so on, and more rural, communism was really, for most people, the supreme horror. So, they'd had their own Slovak fascist and Catholic regime during the war, which had been popular up to a point. And so for Slovaks, it was more like the experience of being conquered by the communists rather than having supported them. I mean, I'm generalizing wildly here.
Yes. Well, that's now the Prague Spring. I gather you have fairly clear notions on the role of Dubcek. Now, to outsiders, he was seen as, certainly people like me, uninformed, people like myself, he was, essentially a Czechoslovakian hero. And here you had this country trying to assert its independence, make its own decisions. And next thing, of course, he's dealt with. How inaccurate is that vision of things?
Okay, I mean, I should start by saying Dubcek's obviously a very attractive character. He's very charismatic. I mean, my heart warms when I see his face as well, just like everyone else's. But I think he's been, because it was a comforting narrative for the West to believe in during the Cold War, I think they really underestimated the extent to which he was playing the game like a communist official. And there were periods of, as we're seeing, for example, in China too, there are periods of relaxation and periods of return to the more hardline But the Communist Party functions like the Communist Party. And he never stepped beyond that. I mean, he never at any point suggested that there should be anything like free elections, or, you know, or that the party shouldn't maintain control. I mean, what he was trying to do was to bring about a more attractive side. I mean, very much the sort of thing Gorbachev was doing 20 years later. Mm. And I think, you know, I think his personal contribution and charisma has been exaggerated. And I think it's quite instructive to see his whole career and to see quite how hardline a lot of these so-called liberals were at other points. And also, of course, it was Dubcek himself who brought about the countermeasures. I mean, in the simple story, Dubcek was the hero, and then he was put away, and he was replaced by this terrible man, Husak, who brought in all the, you know, draconian return. But actually, it was Dubcek himself who did that. And yeah, I see him, like others, using, in the way Khrushchev did, using liberal reforms as a way to get rid of predecessors as well. So it's also about his own personal rise to power, I think. And he was a Slovak, by the way. And so was Husak. So it was the only way he could get to, he was the first Slovak to become head of the Communist Party.
See, that's very interesting, because that seems to me an example of the way most people, or certainly people like myself, would have thought that the USSR was a huge number of states which were held together by Russia and communism, and they were groaning under this yoke, and that really all that was needed was remove the grip of Russia, and you'd be back to a happy state where you had, or a happy position where you had a lot of independent states. But that's a misguided notion, is it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think in the West, you know, we tend to think of the communist period as if it were a bad spell that was put on Europe, and, you know, and everything was frozen, and then the good fairy came along and waved the wand and everything was wonderful. Yeah. You know, life isn't like that. So the communist system, you know, was so comprehensive and so ingrained in everything. And of course, not all of it was bad, you know. So there were aspects that people resented and hated, and there were aspects that people relied upon and enjoyed, you know. So it's not and as we can see with the post-communist dissolution throughout Central Europe, you know, people don't say it's wonderful now and it was terrible then. That's not what you hear people saying on the streets. So.
What were the things that they would have, when they were under communism, what were the things that they would have welcomed or would have felt were positive factors in their lives?
I mean, I should preface this by saying people complained a lot and said their leaders were idiots, and, you know, but then that's what people say now too, you know. So,
with some justification.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure justification then as well. But of course, yeah, I think the things people really resented and minded were not being able to travel freely, and not being able to say what they liked, maybe, and maybe the staged elections people resented. But a lot of things, you know, it was quite nice to be able to have healthcare and no unemployed and no people, you know, no homeless people, and, you know, nationalized medicine and free, you know, childcare and summer camps. And, you know, it wasn't all bad. And of course, Czechs and Slovaks, just about everyone had a second home in the country where they could escape from their big, and they still do, you know, escape from the big high-rise flats and the drudgery, and they'd go off and, you know, pretty much every weekend and in the summers and holidays. So there's quite a lot of nostalgia too for, I suppose, the lack of, you know, genuinely the lack of very large distance in income between people does make for more of a, you know, in some ways a kinder society, I would say. So.
I'm very struck by the fact that when the Czechs and the Slovaks parted ways eventually, they did that peacefully. That's not usually the way states end. Yeah.
I mean, I think it didn't come out of a clear blue sky in one way, because one of the very few reforms in the Prague Spring that stuck was the federalization of the state. So from 1968, it was actually a federation of two republics. And of course, it didn't really make any difference because the Communist Party was in charge of everything anyway. So it was very token. But I suppose what it meant was that all the institutions were already in place. So they already had their own parliament. They already had their own executive. They, you know, all of those systems were already in place, even though they were token. So it made it very easy to move into separate republics. But the really surprising thing about the split was that nobody wanted it. So, you know, there was no referendum. Every time an opinion poll was taken, both Czechs, the majority of Czechs and Slovaks agreed that they did not want to split. They wanted to stay in the same state. So the surprise is why it happened at all.
Well,
you know?
Why did it happen? That's astonishing. Why did it happen? And that's another reason for it not being peaceful then, you know.
Well, it was imposed. It was agreed by the two prime ministers in a completely undemocratic way, which I don't think would have been possible if they hadn't just come from an authoritarian regime, actually. So there was nothing democratic about it. But on the other hand, it was a pragmatic solution to the fact that although Czechs and Slovaks wanted to stay together, they couldn't agree on anything. They couldn't agree on their past. They couldn't agree which holidays were the correct ones and which were the wrong ones. They couldn't agree who the national heroes and villains were. They couldn't agree on whether they wanted to join the EU now or later, whether they wanted to go to NATO now or later. So, you know, so they had different economies. They were at different stages. They had different outlooks. So in the end, it was two politicians just got to a point where they said, look, we just have to split. We can't hang about, because I suppose there was this sense of urgency that they had to get into the Western club as soon as possible. So there was a kind of race. And I think the Czech half thought that Slovakia was going to drag it down and hold it back because it was more agrarian. It was less industrialized, less urbanized. Its industries suffered disproportionately when the rules suddenly changed. So, you know, Slovakia had more of the heavy industry, and which was no longer really wanted. So it was a pragmatic solutions, and I think people accepted it. I mean, they didn't like it, but I mean, as it happens, it's hard to think of a time when Czechs and Slovaks have been violent. Actually, I mean, there are some instances, but not that many.
Now that they are two separate states, does the question of territory come back into the equation, or is it still this notion of language that binds people together?
That's a good question, isn't it? I'd say the two are more coterminous now. So the Czech half, having been a very multinational state, 1/3 German, you know, a large proportion of Poles, a large portion. I mean, it's 90% Czech now. So there's not anything really to discuss. The ethnicity, the only group that's left, and interestingly enough, is still very much discriminated against, are the Roma, and then Vietnamese as well, some Vietnamese. In Slovakia is more, it has more ethnic diversity still. It still has Hungarians, it has Eastern, Ruthenians, and there are still tensions with those ethnicities.
Really?
So, yeah.
And are the political parties based on that?
Yeah. And quite a lot of grievances and resentments, and, you know.
So it's not all happiness in Slovakia, anyway.
Not all over. It's not all over.
Yeah. A general question, really, coming to the end, Mary. Does it seem to you that the notion of nationalism, whether you're talking simply in terms of language or you're talking in terms of language and territory, has been a force for good over the last 100 years, 150 years, or a divisive force that separated people, separated states?
I mean, in Czechoslovakia, you can see that it's led to, there is something very lovely about the coziness of the community that's shared on language, shared on food, culture. You know, I do rejoice in that and really enjoy that when I'm there. On the other hand, I think you can't turn your gaze away from the cruelties and in many cases, real atrocities that it has also perpetuated. So in the Czechoslovak case, you know, large, and it's not solely to do with Czech nationalism, but I think this cocktail of rival nationalisms in the region has led to an enormous amount of bloodshed and cruelty. I mean, tens and hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions of people expelled. So it's been a very bloody 20th century, and yet I still do enjoy what it's like on the inside. So it does have a positive side too.
Are those tensions still there? Like you said, in the 20th century, there were these terrible atrocities. Are those sort of tensions that might lead to the same kind of thing still there?
I worry about the Roma. I worry about what could happen if the circumstances were right. Yeah, I think, and I think racism is very unapologetic there. Partly ignorance, partly just not being exposed to a multicultural society where that's not permitted, so you believe what you hear. But I think the dangers of intolerance towards other ethnicities is real.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it takes the right. Usually, the real atrocities happen in wartime, don't they? Yeah. But yeah.
Okay, a last question, Mary, and just to move away from Czechoslovakia. At the moment, we have the EU and Brexit, with the UK breaking away from a bigger unit of countries. And the reason they did that, they say, or one of the reasons, is that the EU is heading towards a super state. Within the UK, you have movement that looks as if you might have the UK having Scotland or even Wales or certainly Ireland declaring themselves as being separate nationalities and independent states. What's your view on that? I mean, would it be better that we'd be moving towards a sort of a post-nationalist era? John Hume, one of the great nationalist leaders here, spoke of, you know, we're living in a post-nationalist age. Having said that, over the next 10 years, his party just went right down the drain.
Right.
So I'm wondering what your thinking is as a historian.
I mean, I suppose I worry about, I mean, this is maybe not from my view from some vantage point as a historian, but I suppose more a personal response. I am not keen on the dark. I mean, I think nationalism probably always has a dark side, or the potential for that persecution of the other, because it's almost always predicated on I'm me because I'm not you.
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm not a great fan. I mean, I would rather have a multinational, or at least, I mean, I suppose if we run back to the Habsburg case in a minute, if that census had allowed you to have more than one nationality, I wouldn't have had a problem with it. You know, Brexit wouldn't be so painful to me if I were allowed to choose to be European as well as British, let's say.
Yes.
So if you get the option to have more than one, I don't have a problem with it. Where you can only have one at the exclusion of the others, I think it's a path that leads in the end to war and intolerance and cruelty. Yeah.
There are people, this is just the last throwaway comment, there are people in Ireland who would say that the whole notion of nationalism is a deception, that really, well, all you're changing essentially is the flag colour and the, you know, what colour the pillar boxes are painted. That what really matters is the way that the society is organised, and so that you don't have a class that is suffering, working class, and a middle class is comfortable, and then an elite rich. Would class, I must say I have something with that in a way, because I find myself at ease. I lived in Canada for a time, and I found myself more at ease talking to Canadians of my own class, so to speak, than I did with Irish people who were maybe, you know, good people, but I didn't have that much in common with them.
I suppose I'm wary of groupthink and generalizations about groups. So I think, you know, I'd prefer to live in a world where people are judged on their individual characteristics and not looked at always through this prism of class or nationality. You know, that may sound rather idealistic or unlikely to happen, but I don't think it's impossible to reconceive the way we look at people, you know, and it just seems to me that it carries within the seeds of it the likelihood of conflict, actually.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. That is